This critique looks at a piece on the Christian discipline of stillness, which uses biblical examples before guiding prayer over 7 foundational promises.
It's a rich and very relevant topic, so let's just jump right in and look at some ways to really maximize its impact.
Okay, so our first point really has to do with refining the structural flow, specifically in the prayer section toward the end.
Absolutely. I mean, the material is incredibly well researched, especially that second half, where you go into the 7 foundational promises.
Right, and there's a very clear pattern running through it. You break down each promise, piece, projection, whatever it is, into a 3-part structure.
A quote, an explanation, and then a directive prayer.
Exactly. It's very clear. But I think the question becomes, what's the cost of that clarity?
That's it. That commitment to a systematic approach is commendable, but I do wonder if there's a risk here. By keeping that exact 3-part sequence for all 7 promises, you might be creating a kind of structural redundancy.
You mean listener fatigue?
That's the danger. The content itself is excellent. I mean, you're covering provision from Philippians, guidance from the Psalms, but when the listener hits the 3rd or 4th repetition of that, quote, explain, pray pattern,
It starts to feel predictable.
it becomes predictable. The form starts to overshadow the content, you know? It almost feels like a checklist you're working through.
I see. So the process becomes the focus rather than the promise itself.
Precisely. Each promise is unique and powerful, but they're all being presented through this identical lens. And that just diminishes the impact of the final few points, because the listener is already anticipating the cycle. They're not fully engaged with the truth anymore.
So the suggestion isn't to cut any of the promises, but to maybe vary the rhythm a little?
Exactly. You vary the presentation. The idea is to create thematic clusters for promises that are related. This lets the listener absorb the concepts more efficiently without having to wait for that full structure to repeat 7 separate times.
Okay, but let me ask this. Is there a risk that by grouping them, you might dilute the focus on each individual promise, make them seem less important?
And that's a fair question. And it really comes down to editorial judgment. The goal isn't dilution, it's efficiency. You have to trust the listener. We're essentially trading 7 very repetitive points for maybe 4 or 5 more dynamic, integrated concepts. You still deliver the same core truths, but the pacing just feels stronger.
Could you give me a concrete example of what that might look like in practice?
Sure. Let's take 2 promises that deal with, say, God's blessing on our work. You have Psalm 90.17, establish the work of our hands, and Psalm 5:12, about favor as a shield.
Okay.
So, instead of 2 separate sections, you could group those into one cohesive segment on divine labor and favor. You address success and protection in one integrated moment.
I see.
And you could do the same thing with Isaiah 41:10, I am with you, and Psalm 46:1, an ever-present help in trouble. Combine them into a single unified point about unwavering security.
So right there, by combining those 4 verses into 2 concepts, security and favor, you've condensed that whole middle section.
Exactly. The audience gets a burst of related truth, which feels really powerful. And then you can go back to the full 3-part structure for the other more distinct promises. It dramatically improves the overall pacing. And that leads us pretty seamlessly to our second point.
Which is the need for alignment between the message and the presentation style.
Right. This is where the rubber meets the road. If the whole subject is stillness, the medium has to reflect that stillness.
And the material makes a great case for it. It highlights that stillness is not passive, but an active stance in confidence.
Yeah, the theology is beautiful. Citing Moses at the Red Sea, stand still, or Elijah hearing God not in the hurricane, but in that still small voice. It's all there.
So where's the disconnect?
Well, the disconnect is in the delivery. There's a huge contrast between the message, which is all about rest and quietness, and the actual style. The style uses non-stop declarations, this kind of rhetorical urgency.
All those questions.
A cascade of questions. Do you hear that? Who do you depend on? Can you wait for him? It's this relentless high-energy pace that is actively working against the theological truth you're presenting.
Right. I understand that tension. You want the message to be engaging, so there's a tendency to fill every second with energy. But here, that energy is accidentally modeling the exact striving and frenzy the content is trying to solve.
You've nailed it. You are inviting the listener into a state of rest, but the tone is pushing them forward, demanding a response right now.
So what's the fix?
The suggestion is to intentionally build in strategic, reflective pauses, moments of actual quiet. Especially right after a powerful piece of scripture, you have to let the listener's heart and mind catch up to the concept of rest you're talking about.
So you're saying we need to teach the discipline of stillness by literally using silence in the audio.
Yes.
But isn't there a risk that, a long silence might make the listener think the recording stopped or just cause them to tune out?
It's a risk, but it's a calculated one. And you mitigate it by making the pauses strategic, timed. When a moment of silence follows a really profound truth, it doesn't feel like a gap. It functions like an exclamation point. It becomes the space for internal application. Think of it like a rest in a piece of music. It gives shape to the notes around it.
The spiritual rest, I like that. So give me an example of how that would actually sound.
Okay, let's take that amazing verse from Isaiah 30:15. In returning and rest you shall be saved. In quietness and in trust shall be your strength.
Right.
After you recite that verse, instead of jumping to the next question, you just stop for 4, maybe 5 seconds. Complete silence. And then, after that pause, you come back with a soft, declarative statement like, "This is the core of our strength." You force the listener to experience the quiet you're advocating for.
It models it immediately. What about that Elijah story?
Oh, that's critical. When you're talking about 1 Kings 19, how God wasn't in the wind or the earthquake or the fire, the delivery has to shift completely.
How so?
You have to deliberately slow your pace way down. Lower the intensity, lower the volume. When you get to the phrase, still small voice, you almost whisper it. You have to sonically convey the power that whisper carried over all the other chaos. The delivery has to sound still.
So the stillness itself becomes powerful.
That's the key. Still and powerful.
Okay, let's shift gears now to maximizing the emotional impact, especially with that personal story you included.
Yes. This is all about anchoring the spiritual concept in a real, modern, relatable story.
In the story of Marcus the architect, it's perfect. He misses this huge interview because of traffic and a dead phone, only to find out later the company completely imploded in the 2008 crash.
It's a fantastic illustration of God's protective timing. It really shows how waiting can be a shield, not a hindrance.
It's an amazing anecdote.
It is a very high-leverage anecdote, but here's the weakness. It's presented too late, and it's too isolated from the main theme. Right now, it's just a nice little story at the end to illustrate waiting. It needs to be integrated into the core discipline of stillness right from the start.
So you're saying the listener needs to see the connection between Marcus, stuck in traffic, phone dead, panicking?
Yes. That chaos is the modern version of the pressure Moses felt at the Red Sea. They're the same spiritual problem.
So the anecdote is currently being served as dessert when it should be the main seasoning for the whole dish. We lose the emotional hook by holding it back for so long.
You've got it. If stillness is about choosing trust over panic, we have to introduce the panic right away to establish the stakes. The suggestion is to use the Marcus story as a framework, a thematic thread you can weave through the whole piece.
So you introduce his panic early on.
Introduce his panic and frustration, that feeling of wanting control right at the beginning. That way, all the theological points about stillness and trust, like from Proverbs, they become the direct, timely antidote to his very real, very modern anxiety.
That gives the ancient scripture an immediate practical weight. The moment we define the problem as frenzy, we can attach Marcus's specific, professional frenzy right to it.
Yes. I want to feel the intensity of that mental struggle, that knot in his stomach right at the start. Because that chaos is what makes the final revelation of God's perfect timing so incredibly powerful. It grounds the theology in a conflict every single listener has felt.
So where are some specific points we could inject Marcus's story, other than just the beginning and end?
Okay, so right after you define stillness as choosing trust over panic and faith over frenzy, that's when you bring him in. Don't wait. You mentioned the moment he was mentally kicking himself for every decision as his phone died in traffic.
His experience becomes the emotional touchstone for frenzy.
I see.
Then, later, when you're discussing the idea that God's plan was better than mine ever could have been, you explicitly contrast the security Marcus thought he wanted, the high-paying job, the benefits, with the security he actually received.
And that contrast is everything. The security he received was being perfectly positioned as an independent contractor right after all the big, quote-unquote, secure firms went under in the crash.
That's the story. You show how his initial disaster was actually divine preparation. And by doing that, you turn the anecdote from a late illustration into the central, modern proof point for the entire message.
That stillness actually positions you for a success you couldn't have planned for yourself.
Exactly.
Okay, that brings us to the end of our critique. I mean, the material submitted is powerful. It's clearly written, but these adjustments are really designed to enhance its delivery and how the listener engages with it.
Absolutely. These changes can help transform the content from an insightful theological study into a really integrated, experience-based message.
Okay, so let's just quickly recap the main opportunities we've identified.
Sure. First, look at grouping those 7 foundational promises. It'll streamline the structure, cut down on the repetition, and just keep the momentum going in that second half.
Right. Second, make sure the presentation style actually models the quietness and rests that you're talking about.
Use those intentional pauses, lower the rhetorical urgency, let the message breathe.
And finally, that amazing personal story about Marcus.
Bring it in earlier. Weave it throughout the entire piece. Use it to ground the theology of stillness in a modern, relatable conflict.
These are really sharp, actionable suggestions. They're designed to heighten the impact and focus of what is already a powerful message. We look forward to seeing how you apply them, and we invite you to submit your work back in again for more feedback down the line.